So you need to unmute yourself.
Yes. Anshkan, are you hear me now?
Yes, good evening. Very good evening.
Hello, Rakesh.
Hi, how are you? Thank you.
I'm good. Thank you so much. You know, Rakesh, we are using the platform of the Avadh Girls Degree College because they have students in the master's program also. And a large number of faculty members were interested in listening to you. And so we thought that it might be good to have you linked through Avadh, which can then probably host your lecture because they're recording it on the YouTube channel for future reference for the students and for anybody else who might want to access it. So Upma, would you like to make a formal welcome?
Okay. I welcome Dr. Professor Rakesh Chandra ji, and we all love listening to him always. It's a pleasure knowing what all he knows. He's expert in his field, and especially for all academic affairs. So we love to listen. And thank you, Professor Nishi Pandey, for organizing this program. And I thank Diksha and I thank Ansh for coordinating and organizing it so well. I welcome you all to this wonderful session.
Thank you.
Thank you, Upma. And now for giving you a small introduction about Professor Chandra. Professor Rakesh Chandra has been the head of the Department of Philosophy. And along with that, Professor Chandra has also held many important academic and administrative positions in the university. Presently, he's Dean Academics and is also looking after Sanskritiki as its director. But importantly, his expertise and the domain knowledge that he has on philosophy is something that I have always benefited from in my long years of association with him as a friend and as, someone who's always been there for me, more than a friend and an academic collaborator. We've worked together collaboratively on very many projects over these 40 years of knowing one another. And I don't want to take too much of the time, except to say that I'm really, really grateful to you, Rakesh, that you have agreed to come today. This is a class on Indian intellectual tradition and Indian aesthetics, which I teach in the master's program in the semester 2. Now, when I was discussing Indian intellectual tradition with them, some of the students expressed the desire that they wanted to know a little bit more about the Indian philosophical traditions. And therefore, I thought that it would be best to invite a person who is from that domain and no one better than you. I'm extremely grateful. I know that you've had a very long day. You've been working on various committees and the Zoom meetings continue, and you're physically present in the university. Thank you very much for joining us. And we are recording this, Rakesh, for your information and for the information of all the students. And we are hopeful that this will be of use to students who are unable to attend or those who would be want to access it in the future. Thank you very much for Dr. Chaturvedi, Dr. Ansh Sharma, who will soon be a doctor, and Diksha and others from the faculty of Avadh Girls Degree College who have joined. And I'm grateful for all of your presence. Welcome to everyone. And I'd now like to hand over to Professor Rakesh Chandra, who will be talking to us initially about the Indian intellectual traditions. And I'm sure he'll be happy to take comments. Can I request Ansh Sharma to please note down if there are any questions that are coming up during the talk so that we can then ask Professor Chandra to address them. Is that possible, Ansh?
Yes, ma'am. I'll be doing it.
Thank you very much. And I now hand you over to, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Rakesh Chandra from the Department of Philosophy and the Dean Academics of the University of Lucknow.
Thank you very much. It's indeed my great honor and pleasure always to be with my very, very dear friend, Nishi. We have been known in the whole university for being these two people together. who represented the rhyme and the reason of everything. And we kept on wondering who would be the rhyme and who would be the reason. And we have been together like friends. And I think the why I'm saying this is that in Plato, in one of his letters, he says that it is actually in benevolent disputation that sometimes there is a fire which emerges, and that is the fire which gives the light of knowledge. So we have had our benevolent disputations, sometimes not so benevolent too. But the engagement of the intellectual tradition in India, I think, also needs to be seen precisely in this way, that it has been a very, very long, centuries-long tradition of engaging with each other, engaging with nature and understanding. And let me just begin with, because I have not got a prepared script, and nor am I going to take you down in a very orderly way, but I'll try to see that what are the kinds of things which may interest you and which we can subsequently then develop as and when you want. One of the things I think we could begin with the modern times, what we call the modern times, where the universities came into India, and we are all products of modernity. And one big figure in Indian modernity, I think we all know, is that when you were looking at Ram Mohan Roy and Aurobindo Ghosh, this is a time wherein there was supposed to be something which we call the Indian Renaissance. Now, you are all familiar with the Renaissance, and that is why I want to begin from the middle and then take you back. Now, when there was a talk of Indian Renaissance, that was a time when people were raising the kind of questions which continue to haunt us even now. People like you and people like me and Professor Pandey and Professor Chaturvedi and all of us in our generation, and also the generation prior to us, who actually were products of the colonial education in the colonial times. One of the very important things which somehow or the other had come to stay was that actually the Indian intellectual tradition is not rational. One of the things that we were told that, okay, you may have philosophy, you may have religion, you may have music, you may have dance, but you do not have reason. In sciences and in all other things, you actually have to be learners and imitate the West. And I just call your attention to that in 1920, there is a series of lectures which Sri Aurobindo writes on is there an Indian need for an Indian Renaissance? Is Indian culture rational, and all of those things, which are very, very important questions which continue to haunt us even today. One of the questions which I want to begin with, again, as a diversion, and I'll come to Indian philosophy, is that when this question came that should India have a Renaissance, then the question was that what does Renaissance mean? And you all know that it was generally understood in a very broad way to be a new birth as well as a recovery of the old time spirit. Now, the old time spirit was taken even in Europe, and not everybody took it in their own way. In Germany, it took a very Teutonic turn, and in certain other things, it took a Celtic turn, and different turns came with Renaissance. So Europe had this age of Renaissance. Now, in India, they say that the age of the Renaissance could be actually dated to the political happenings, very robust happenings in 1905. And they say that, there was always a dormant Shakti in India. And but that Shakti had become dormant, and it had also become dwindled a little. And there were, of course, many, many shackles. Many of the shackles had come from outside, and many of the shackles were our own. And they had to be broken. And some of these people say that, this happens with all civilizations, but most of the civilizations perish. India, fortunately, did have the spirit of recovery. And so it tried to break it and come out of it, of course, with a new body. Now, when this debate was going on, Mr. Cousins wrote, but why should India have a reawakening? India was never sleeping. So we were always awake. So where is a reawakening? Europe needs to reawake. Why should India need to reawake? And to that, Sri Aurobindo has a very interesting and a candid answer. He said, to an outsider, it might seem that we were always awake, but we as children of this civilization know that we also went through a bad patch where our knowledge and science and intellectual traditions had become ossified and petrified. And we had become complacent, and many of the things really needed a recovery. We just can't say that, no, we always had it and we are still alive. So the Indian spirit is not gone, but it needs to change, and this has to be done. The Europeans, and this I think I need to repeat again and again to students of English literature, particularly because in literary criticism, and I'll come to that point, one of the things was that people kept on saying that, as I said, that they said कि नहीं, India के पास metaphysics है, India के पास spirituality है, it has this understanding of the infinite, but largely the spirit of India is turning away from the world. That you are otherworldly people and you believe in the Maya, and especially with the identification of Buddhism, they said that this is your spirit. Interestingly, the Indians also echoed it, and they thought कि ये तो हमारी तारीफ कर रहे हैं कि भाई हम तो बड़े बढ़िया, we have great philosophies and great religion, and reluctantly they also had to accept Indian art and literature. How could they not? But this kind of a partial view about India, like partial view about any other civilization, is completely incorrect. And this I want to say that this idea that the Indians echoed a view about themselves which was thrust upon them by the West is a view which you all know generally in the name of Edward Said, who is saying this in 1968. And this is what Aurobindo is saying in 1920. So this is what I want to remind you. And who's Sri Aurobindo? Aurobindo is, of course, a man who was actually so anglicized that his parents, like our parents, mine and Nishi's father, with bowler hats and bow ties in their youth, they were so anglicized that at one time they wanted their children to be completely anglicized. And when Aurobindo was sent to England, there was a clear-cut instruction that they should meet no Indian families over there. The name of Aurobindo was actually Aurobindo Ackroyd Ghosh. It is only much later that he got, because the way destiny had to take him and the way we had to get the fruits of his extraordinary genius, he subsequently read all the Indian tradition and then discovered most of it. But this, I think, is very important, which I want to put on record, is that even these theories of literary criticism, which we attribute so importantly to people like Said and the others, have had antecedents. And here is a glorious antecedent in the writings of Sri Aurobindo. And this is 1920. Very well published and written in an English which is far more eloquent than any Englishman can write. So the idea that Indian mind is spiritual is, of course, correct. Everybody accepts that. And what is that idea? That is an idea somehow or the other that we have a sense of the infinite. And the life cannot be just lived by mere externalities. So all the traditions of India, even the crassest of them, did believe that actually life cannot be lived only in terms of externality. But India was also alive to its material laws, the physical laws, the sciences, and as I said, that they were all seen as related to the spiritual. So we have gods beyond man, we have gods beyond God, and we have the infinite Brahman beyond, in the ineffable, beyond the gods. So this is the kind of brave, sometimes audacious kind of a thing, which you find that, if you look at other civilizations and their religions somehow, again, I am using it within quotes because the othering is really not a very nice thing. But nonetheless, you find that in most of the religions, it is supposed to be impossible, sometimes a sacrilege, to claim that actually you can be one with God. But here, we are claiming our identity with God, and we are claiming of our identity beyond God. And we are saying that if we trained our will, we can go and attain anything. So there is a stupendous vitality in the Indian civilization, and there is a great inexhaustible power, as it were. And if we are saying 3,000 years at least, or maybe more, there is a lavish creation. There are big republics which are formed. You also know the Sola Mahajanpad. There are kingdoms like the Mauryan Empire and the Gupta Empire. There are philosophies, at least 12, 13, 15 different ones. There are cosmogonies. There are sciences of all sorts, not just Ayurveda, all sorts of sciences about. There's the Shulva Sutra, there is the Charak Samhita, there are creeds, there are arts, there are poems, there are monuments, there are palaces, there are public works, there are social orders, and psychic sciences, then there's yoga. No, and there are trades, arts, सब चीजों के बारे में है. So if people were to say that India is a life-denying civilization, if its philosophy is supposed to be otherworldly, then it is completely belied by the presence of these absolutely long traditions of very detailed work. And also, if you want to see that how India expanded herself, so you find that whether it's Egypt or Mesopotamia or Rome, there are responses to India. And especially if you look at Buddhism, the voice of Buddha went to Afghanistan, it went to Japan, it went to China. And some people have a very interesting take to say that actually it is the voice of the Upanishads and the voice of Buddha, which actually again is echoed back to us from the lips of Jesus Christ, the idea of love and compassion, of universality, etc., etc. So by this, I just wanted to highlight that the Indian intellectual tradition is not one-sided. It is extremely rich. And though on the one hand, you really have the austerities presented, but on the other hand, you also have very rich kind of ideals of material possession. So you have the idea of the Samudragupta, Chandragupta, etc., as the Digvijayi, and there is the idea of Veer Bhogya Vasundhara. And there is also the other idea, Ten Tyaktena Bhunjitva, that you should actually relish with a spirit of renunciation. So you have all those spirits very well. And it is amazing that if you look at the time of Ashoka, and if you also look at the time of the Mohammedans, you find there is prolific writing, enormous writing before the printing press. And they were writing on something which was absolutely fragile, like the palm leaf, but yet they were able to do so much of work in each of these things in detail. So in yoga, in logic, in dramaturgy, in meditation, in astronomy, in the art of painting, घोड़े के बाल कैसे काढ़े जाएंगे, इसके बारे में भी there's a full shastra. So it's amazing. So the idea of world denying is actually very ill suited to the understanding of the Indian mind and the Indian intellectual tradition. But this, I think, is right, that the spirituality does not completely flounder. And also another thing which I have to emphasize, which is brought forward by many people, that spirituality actually does not come in impoverished cultures. The impoverished people are actually so caught up in the immediate that they are generally despondent, discouraged, and intimidated. So this kind of a spirituality which comes in the Indian tradition comes through a feeling of great sense of abundance and a great sense of internal joy. So this idea that we are some kind of a joyless Mayavadis has been because they identified with us primarily with one version of Buddhism, which was only true for a very small period of time. Buddhism has had great contribution in giving a challenge to the Vedics and giving them other kinds of impetus, but it is not entirely true. So this is the kind of a thing which I wanted to share with you initially. Then when you come to what we call Indian philosophy, there again, the difficulty is with both things. What do you take as Indian? And two, what do you take as philosophy? We all know that, the cartography of India kept on changing. So if you look at the old times, it would be very interesting for you to notice that the area where Panini, who was born, is actually more or less in an area which is to the north of Kashmir, and somewhere maybe it is now in Afghanistan. So you would not say that Paninian grammar is Afghani, but you have to understand that it is Indian because it is about a particular government. Similarly, many other things keep on. So the cartography of the Indian subcontinent kept on changing. And it's only in the time of Ashok and the time of Aurangzeb that the map of India resembles much like what it does today. But nonetheless, we somehow or the other associate a certain kind of a spirit with all that is Indian. So we do not have India in terms of a nation state in the sense of one religion, one blood, one soil. That idea is perhaps not true. But on the other hand, the basic conceptions of a people and what they idealized can somehow be put together. Now, when we look at philosophy, again, the term philosophy has a difficulty, or we also have whether philosophy can be appropriately translated as darshan in India, Also, we have to see whether darshan in India was the only term used for philosophy, because primarily earlier people used to use the term Brahma Vidya, Atma Vidya. These are the kinds of terms which are being used and not necessarily darshan. Darshan actually is coming from Samyak Darshan and the other, the Dithi conception, which you find in Buddhism. In Pali, it is called Dithi, and that is how it is coming. So there are all sorts of difficulties with that. And also, I think the Indian Western thing always needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. Because if we were all to know, we were taught in class 5 that the world is round. So the center of the world has to be somewhere in the middle of the world. Now, if I am describing myself, then most of our foreign friends say, but why are you calling yourself Eastern? Because when we call ourselves Eastern and then Western, then we are somehow or the other assuming that the center of the world is somewhere in Europe. How is the center of the world in Europe? It cannot be. Geographically, geologically, it has no sound. It is only because the Europeans had taken all the power to themselves and decided that we are the center of the world. So, mere west mein jo hoga wo western, or mere east mein jo hoga eastern. So it's more political rather than geographical. But nonetheless, can we say that there is something which is common to Indian philosophical tradition? And there, I think, in a very broad view, I first try to say that, one use of the term philosophy in India was that it is a science of review of everything. So it is a rational, critical review of economics, of culture, of living, of theology, of education. And this is the sense which is actually represented in the term which we must all remember, which is a very important part, which is called anviksha, the science of review. So whenever, like you must have seen that there is, we have a special department which is called the Department of Philosophy, but you must have studied any subject, then you will have, you're studying history, then there is a paper called Philosophy of History. You study mathematics, there's another paper which is called Philosophy of Mathematics. Now, what is the difference between history and philosophy of history? History will tell you about dates and times and places. But what is history? What is evidence? What is explanation? These are not questions of history, but they are questions about history. So in that case, philosophy becomes a conceptual analysis of what is there at the basic level of all subjects. So what is beauty? What is rasa, etc.? These you are all studying as a part of aesthetics. Aesthetics is a part of philosophy because this is, you are reviewing the whole thing. So a review of the cultural, artistic dimensions and the concepts involved in that, all of that is taken care of in aesthetics. In argumentation, what are the kinds of things that is taken care of in logic. In knowledge, what is knowledge? Now, everybody tries to get knowledge, but what is knowledge? What are the conditions of knowledge? When we say it is justified true belief, what would justification consist in? What would truth mean? Does truth mean correspondence with reality? Does it mean coherence with of mutual statements? Does it mean pragmatic utility? All those questions come in. So one definition in India was about anviksha, and they said that this is the science of review. The other definition of philosophy was actually the technical definition of philosophy, wherein philosophy means any body of knowing which has 4 or 5 important components. One, metaphysics. And what does metaphysics talk about? On what there is. It raises the question, what is the fundamental truth of nature? Is it changing? So people like Heraclitus were saying it is ever changing. Buddha was saying it is ever changing. You read it in William James' stream of consciousness, etc., ever changing reality. Then there are those people who believe that no, reality is never changing. You have the Parmenidean tradition, you have the Vedanti tradition, and even in the materialist tradition, sometimes they will believe it's unchanging. So whether reality is changing or unchanging, whether reality is one or many, what is the nature of consciousness? Is there consciousness only a product of material things, or there are two things like Descartes, matter and form, or it is only a behavior of that? Now, these are the kinds of questions which are, or what is causality, what is substance, etc., etc. Now, these are 101 kind of questions about what there is and what is its nature. These are discussed in metaphysics. So metaphysics is one part of philosophy. So Advait Vedanta says there is only one reality. Ramanuj himself in Advaita, he said, no, there are two. The Jeev and Brahma and Ishwar, all of them are real. Maya is also real. Then Sankhya says there is Prakriti and Purush. Nyaya says that there are fundamental atoms. I'll come to that again. But this is the second position. So metaphysics is all about what there is. The second thing which is important in philosophy is knowledge. What is the nature of knowledge? How do you have knowledge? What is the condition of valid and invalid knowledge? What are the conditions of how you will get into error? And then there is this whole question about what are the sources of knowledge? Is it experience? Is it reason? Is it intuition? In case of religion, of course, you have this whole school which talks about revelation. And in literature and in philosophy, there's a whole bunch of absolutely outstanding writing, which we call mystic writing. They talk about mystic experience. Now, mystic experience is also like sensory experience, but not entirely like it. It is like feeling, but it yet has a cognitive impact. Not only does it have a cognitive impact, it has a great moral force on everybody, and it transforms the lives of not only that person, and they, in fact, start looking at it. So you look at even people in American poets like Whitman and the others, and you look at the Vedic poets, or you look at Kabir and the others, and they have these absolutely, or even the simpler ones like the Romantics, when Wordsworth is talking about Tintern Abbey and the others. So all those people are talking about so mystical experience, but in terms of scientific knowledge, it is no knowledge. So these debates are part of epistemology. The third is about logic, that how to do a valid argument. Fourth is about aesthetics. What is beauty? What is art? What is artistic criticism? And you know, aesthetics has had a very interesting kind of an history. The earliest people, and I think I would not talk about it at all, because I think Professor Pandey must be. Earlier, sometimes they generally thought it is a theory of beauty. Then they said that no, it's not a theory of beauty, it's a theory of art. And now for the past 20, 30 years, mainly aesthetic theory is discussing questions about aesthetic appreciation and critical appreciation of art, not about beauty, nor about art, but about literary criticism or artistic criticism. And that's why critical studies has become the overarching thing which it takes. So this is the second view, which takes metaphysics, epistemology, ethics as part of philosophy. Here, one thing is important. Ethics is generally considered to be a science of what is good and what is not good, and a discussion about what are the standards of good and the other. Along with that, what is very important in Indian philosophy is what is called soteriology in English language. Now, what is soteriology? Soteriology is actually a translation that I found for the term called Moksha Shastra. Because all Indian philosophies, including the materialist philosophies, are saying that we need to get liberated. So this is a science of liberation. And this is, in fact, one area in which I think not all so-called Western philosophy, because I'm not a great champion of the Indian-Western philosophy divide. But nonetheless, Western philosophies, whether it's Plato or Aristotle or Aquinas and Amsterdam, or Descartes and Kant, or the phenomenologists and the existentialists, or Russell and the others, nobody, I think, has a very detailed kind of a commitment that we need to talk about liberation from the world. So they do not have a theory of a moksha or liberation everywhere. Of course, Christianity talks about that, but it's not a part of essentially of all philosophy. So soteriology is certainly one distinctive thing. So the first definition is about a review. The second definition is about a technical definition where you have epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, soteriology, and logic. And the third definition, I think, of philosophy is that it is a kind of an intuitive network of views regarding what is the nature of man, what is the nature of God, what is the nature of society, and how they need to live together, etc., etc. What is the ultimate reality? And in that can be represented in the forms of hymns, talks, writings of the mystics, sages, etc., etc. So all of these things form legitimately the idea of philosophy. Now, in India, generally, I think it is a common thing to believe that there are 6 systems of philosophy, and orthodox philosophies and three systems of heterodox philosophy. Now, this is an oversimplification to begin with. And we need to initially also remember this, क्योंकि इससे पहले कि कोई हमारी गलती निकाले, हम लोग को पहले ये बात मान लेनी चाहिए कि नहीं, ये बात सही नहीं है, सिर्फ इतने ही systems होते हैं, ये बात नहीं है. And if you go by scholarship, you will find कि this is not true. And if you look at one of the most authentic works which we take about 300 BC, when you look at Kautilya's Arthashastra, he talks only about 3. Then some talk about 11. And sometimes in Kautilya, he talks also about 4. The Vedic study, theology, and this is, he's generally talking about education. He's talking about Vedic study, theology, economics, which includes agriculture, politics, and then he talks about Anviksha. So these are the 4 things that he talks about in terms of education. And he says that the examination of the theory that you have, Anviksha, he has only Sankhya theory, the Vaisheshik theory, and the Lokayat theory. And it is interesting, all the 3 theories which he mentions as theories of philosophy, as I mentioned, are all do not believe in God, and it's very interesting kind of thing. So what I'm trying to tell you right now again is that when you look at historically and scholastically, the very idea of what is Indian philosophy is also problematic. But nonetheless, broadly, we talk about 6 systems of Indian philosophy and 3 systems of Indian philosophy which are heterodox. Now, what does heterodox and orthodox mean? Hindi mein aksar they are translated, which is it becomes even more problematic, as astik and nastik. Now, astik normally in Hindi means somebody who believes in God, and nastik means that somebody who does not believe in the existence of God. But here it does not mean that. Astik means those who accept the authority of the Vedas. And here again, I think it is important that actually the positive part is not properly defined. It is the negative part which is generally well defined. The negative theory is Nastiko Veda Nindakaha. Those who criticize the Vedas are Nastik. So the Charvakas, the Jain and the Buddhists clearly, very clearly criticize the Vedas, and therefore they are Nastik. The other 6 systems, as they are called, the Astic systems, do not necessarily believe in the Vedas, because in many cases they don't even quote the Vedas in so many of the texts, but in many cases they do. And it is a very interesting thing that if you look at historically, some people say that the initial stages of Indian intellectual tradition were only suggestive, that they were, क्योंकि अगर आप पूरे सब वेदों को पढ़ें तो वेदों में तो ज़्यादातर it begins with only wonder, and there are hymns, and they say सृष्टि के पहले कुछ था कि कुछ नहीं था, क्या कोई जानता है, क्या कोई भी नहीं जानता. So it's wonder and suggestiveness. Subsequent stage came where they tried to find orderliness, which is the age of the Dharma Shastras, that where they're trying to find order in the universe and also then trying to create a similar order in the world. And that is the age of the Dharma Shastra. It is the 3rd stage, which is called the age of the Sutras, which is actually the stage of discursive thinking and intellection. Many people think that actually this came only because the Buddhists were challenging कि ये सब तुम लोग कह रहे हो, all this that you are saying and believing, what are your grounds? So it was not that they did not have ground, but they did not feel the need for giving a justification. But when provoked to give a ground, then you have this absolutely brilliant tradition of intellection wherein these systems develop. Now, these 6 systems, which are generally taken to be the 6 systems of classical Indian philosophy. Of course, 2 systems are, but let me give you these 6 first. The first is generally called the Purva Mimamsa, and the other is called Uttar Mimamsa. Then there is Sankhya with a complementary Yoga. Then there is Nyaya and Vaisheshik. Now, all those people who keep on saying that Indian people are world denying are also the people who also say that all the Indian people and all the Indian philosophies believe in God. And let me dispel this thing for you for once for all, that no, most of the Indian philosophies do not believe in God at all, and certainly not the kind of God which is generally accepted in the Christian monotheistic tradition in the schools that we went to, oh God, thou Father in heaven types. Because it is very clear that when you look at Sankhya, in the Sankhya Karika, the only two things which exist in the world are Prakriti and Purush. Now, what is Prakriti? Prakriti is everything which is actually unconscious. Interestingly, the unconscious is the one which is active. The Purush is inactive and conscious. And Prakriti has three qualities, the Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas in it, in a state of equilibrium. It comes in contact with the Purush. Since the Sattva quality very much resembles the consciousness, through its luminosity, it is able to reflect that. And then the equilibrium is disturbed. And then the evolution begins. And in that evolution, everything 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, the things keep on happening. And it has a large number. And that is why it is called Sankhya. Sankhya. There are so many things which come into that. Interestingly, what we call the mind, what we call the ego, the manas, the chit, the ahankar are all part of Prakriti, not Purush. Now, many people who, again, enthusiastic people who want to also find feminist criticism of Indian philosophy, there is much reason to do that. But here also they say कि Prakriti ko unhone अचेतन मान लिया और पुरुष को चेतन मान लिया. This is absolutely not correct, because ego, mind, reasoning, all of that is part of Prakriti. And Mahat, the word which is used for Prakriti, is actually in Sanskrit a pulling, not even striling. So the accusation, because this is really like saying that Prakriti in ordinary language, it means like trees and mountains, and Purush means a male body. But that cannot be read. And it's a technical meaning of Prakriti and Purush therein. And it's a brilliant kind of an understanding which there is in the Sankhya philosophy. And unfortunately, we do not have any Mool Sankhya Sutra. We have only the commentaries on it. And you know that in the Indian tradition of philosophizing, nobody was claiming great originality. The original sages were also saying that I have not done it. I have only seen them. Rishayoha mantra drishtaraha. We have seen it. So this claim that I have done it and I am the creator, I think it's really did not matter very much. And so there is a writing, there's a commentary on it, then there's a commentary on that commentary. So there are tikas, then there are lochans, then there are deepikas, and the tradition and tradition and tradition and tradition, in order to make it more precise and make it explainable to everybody. And sometimes in course of that tradition, the original things changes so much that they are bound to give it a new name. Say, for instance, the old Nyaya, subsequently in the 17th century, had to call itself Navya Nyaya, because many of the original assumptions had to be so transformed that they now could not be called the Prachin Nyaya. And here again, I take 1 minute to call your attention to something which I really find very important to say. You know, when the West was trying to identify Indian or give even a concession to it, and some of the very brilliant people were there, very good people also there, William Jones and the others who learned Sanskrit and did it. But still, they were so overly fascinated by a certain part of Indian philosophy that when they represented India largely in terms of Shankaracharya or Buddhism. And there they also said that these are great intellectual insights of idealism and mystic self-experience, intuitive knowledge. But the whole Nyaya tradition, which is the tradition of extremely precise argumentation and the finest kind of linguistic analysis that exists anywhere in the world. I can say that with certain amount of confidence because I did many workshops on that. Earlier, I was also, like many of us, completely unaware of it and also had a snobbish chip on my shoulder ki inko kaise aa sakta hai. But the fact is that they had this long tradition and the West did not record it. 5 years back, Janardhan Ganeri had written a very nice book, which I think is published by, it's called The Lost Age of Reason. You'll find it. He is saying that actually the West deliberately avoided the representation of Nyaya as Indian philosophy because they did not want to accept that India had a tradition of logical reasoning. because they believed that Aristotle made logic and Aristotle was theirs, which is again also not true, because again, as I said, the world is round, and proximity, if you have to see the proximity, India is far close to what were the Greek states, and Aristotle and Plato exists in more or less the area which was called Bactria, which is far closer to Kashmir than it is to England, and certainly not to America. But this again, we all know that in the 1700s, when they discovered through the Arabic translations and then German translations, then they tried to quickly take the Greek thing as their own. But that's, in fact, my take on that, and many other people who study colonialism, and Professor Pandey will tell you about how the colonial people developed their whole thing, and sometimes maybe innocently, because I am not necessarily too keen on the conspiracy theory, because some of the intellectuals may have genuinely been unaware. But when it has been constructed in a way, and then I think it becomes important that why is it that you think that Indian philosophy is only one when there is so much of variety? So first I said that, there is a Sankhya philosophy which believes in Prakriti and Purush. Interestingly, Sankhya is also a chapter in the Bhagavad Gita, which is called the Sankhya Yoga. This Sankhya Yoga in the Bhagavad Gita is not the representation of the original Sankhya, because original Sankhya only believes in Prakriti and Purush. But in the Sankhya Yoga of the Bhagavad Gita, which comes many centuries later, Prakriti and Purush are brought together by God. Because you know that the Bhagavad Gita is an extrapolation which has been put into the Mahabharata, and it has also, we know that it was actually a part of the Srimad Bhagavat, and etc., etc. So when you study all of that, it's a very, very fascinating see that where does the story come and how does it come. There, Sankhya becomes Ishwarvadi. So there is a Seshwar Sankhya and the Nirishwar Sankhya, the original. Complementary to the philosophy of Sankhya was the philosophy of Yoga. And yoga, one, of course, we know yoga in many meanings. One is we know as general exercise for prevention, for chikitsa, for also the mental discipline, yoga chitta vritti nirodha. But one important meaning of the yoga has been of putting the mind and the soul and the self together, bringing them together, as it were. Interestingly, somehow, in certain philosophies, it's really a kind of a very paradoxical situation that we have been actually by ignorance now actually in a situation where we have actually lost the true knowledge of ourselves, which is the knowledge of the self-same. So we are in a city of viyog, and yoga will finally help us to get back to that situation of the self-same consciousness, where actually there will not be two but only one. In bhakti tradition, you find that this is also represented sometimes in the case of divine love, etc., that the two are merged into one. Prem galiyati sakari jame dona samay. So these are the beautiful kind of things represented. But philosophically, Sankhya is a dualist philosophy. Yoga again has many elements which are said, and it has a philosophical tradition which has certain elements, and yoga does believe in Ishwar. Then there is the Purva Mimamsa and the Uttar Mimamsa. The Purva Mimamsa is generally a science or is an investigation and an understanding which comes from Gemini's Sutras. And it is largely a great account of how that portion is has a great deal of rituals, etc., etc. And they have an understanding of Swarg and Narak and Devis and Devtas. Interestingly, they do not have an idea of God. And Mimamsa says there is a Prabhakar Mimamsa, and there is another school of Mimamsa which is also developed. So from the Shabar Bhasha. So there is a Shabar's interpretation. Now, if you are looking at Mimamsa, they say that you need God primarily for three things. One, you say that how did the world come into being? There must have been a creator. So God is the creator. The other thing, you need a God because you said, who wrote the Vedas? The Vedas need an author. The third and the most important thing is that there has to be a dispenser of justice that if you have done a good deed, that you will be rewarded, and if you have been done a bad deed, then you will be punished, either in this life or in the afterlife. So you need a judge, an author, and a creator. Now, Mimamsa has a very simple answer. He said the world is eternal, so it does not need to be created. The Vedas are eternal, so they don't need an author. The principle of good shall be rewarded and the evil punished is actually imbued in the diurnal course of nature. And you know that word like the back of your hand, everyone. There's a big word which is called rit, capital R and small t and a, rit. In Hindi, I think we have stopped using that word which we learned when we were children, ri. So ri, just a Rigved hota hai. So rit, rin, these are the principal kind of things. So rit is a moral principle as well as the natural principle. So the good shall be rewarded in its natural course and the evil shall be rewarded, punished in the natural course. So why do you need God? It's interesting that some people like Prabhakar say, कि लेकिन अगर कोई मानना ही चाहता है तो मान ले. You don't need it, but if you want to. And it's interesting, they don't believe in God of this kind, but they do believe in the karma theory, and they believe in all these propitiating yagya, karma, etc., etc. They believe in swarg and nark and everything, but they don't believe in God. So it's interesting that how rich, varied, imaginatively constructed, and argumentatively substantiated these theories are. Nobody is saying that we should accept them all. We may not, but look at the wealth of imagination and the strength of the arguments which they are putting forward for each one of them. Like say, for instance, so then you have the Uttar Mimamsa, generally, which is called the Vedant, which is the last part. So because you have the Vedas, then you have the which is the Samhita Sahitya, and then you have the Aranyaks, and then you have the Upanishads. And generally we say that the philosophical argumentative element actually comes to us from the Upanishads and the Sutra Sahitya. The inspiration comes from the Vedas. ये जो सब लोग कह रहे लगता नहीं सब कुछ वेदों में लिखा है, सब कुछ नहीं लिखा है वेदों में. If you will read the Vedas, Vedas are largely hymns, and they are hymns in praise of fire and hymns in praise of water, and and those are the Samhitas. And then you have the Aranyaks, which have certain other kind of a thing. And then you have the Upanishads, where again people say there are 111, but there are 10 or 11 major Upanishads. The first being the shortest, the Ishavasya Upanishad, Ishavasya Sarvam, Yatit Jagatyam Jagat. Everybody learned this shlok when they were in class 5. So, but that inspiration that, everything is permeated by an infinite self, of course, this Upanishadic spirit comes from the Vedas. But to say that everything was actually categorically and well-defined form in the Vedas is not true. No Indian scholar wants to say that this is not true. It developed. So it developed in course of time as in responses to argument and counter-argumentation. And within the same school, say for instance, when you look at the Uttar Mimamsa called the Vedant, generally all of these 5 schools, the school of Madhvacharya, the school of Ramanujana, the school of Vishishtadvait, the school of Shankar, all these schools actually, Dvaita, Vishishtadvait, Dvait of Ramanuj and Advait of Shankaracharya, all of them are interpreting only one text. And what is the text? That is Badrayan's Brahma Sutra. And Brahma Sutra is Chatush Sutra. There are 4 sutras only, which have been led to the interpretation of such varied strengths. And let me just share one thing before I go to the other, because this is the first one. Shankaracharya is supposed to be this great Gyan Margi. And then they say that, Ramanuj is the Bhakti Margi. But you have to see how brilliantly and argumentatively Ramanuj asks this of Shankaracharya. You are saying that the Jeev is the locus of Maya. But Jeev, how can the Jeev be the locus of Maya? Because the Jeev itself is created by Maya. If you're saying that Maya is unreal and the only thing which is real is Brahman, how can it be said at all? Because if the only thing there is Brahman, then there can be no substantial, real, unreal entity of the Maya. Now, I'm not saying that these questions have not been answered. They have been answered methodically by Shankar. But these very logical, pertinent questions are being asked by a person who's generally supposed to be a bhakt. The fact is, Shankaracharya is a bhakt of Shiva. Ramanus is also a bhakt of Vishnu, but also not a bhakt of Shiva. They are all both bhaktas. And when it comes to philosophy, they are doing brilliant argumentation and counter argumentation. The tradition of Indian tradition, and that I think Professor Pandey will also tell you, that when you look at the aesthetic tradition also, and you look to Abhinav Gupta, he's writing poetry, he's writing music, he's writing theory, but he's giving brilliant argumentation, and he's saying, finally, the Shaktopaya, the powerful upaya to get to knowledge is reason. So whatever you say will have to be reasoned out. So this whole charge of Indian civilization being irrational, Indian people accepting everything on faith, or accepting it on the basis of authority, either of the Veda or of the Guru, is completely false, not borne out by any of the whole tradition. I know one professor of mine who used to constantly say there is a Rishi bias in India. I said, there is no Rishi bias in India. And on the other hand, when it comes to not agreeing with your teacher, of course, in all civilizations, it becomes problematic. When Aristotle disagreed with Plato, he was called the fool who kicked his mother. तो ऐसा थोड़ी है कि उन लोगों के लिए आसान रहा होगा. When Darwin came up to his discoveries, he had such a great sense of anxiety that he started vomiting bile, because he thought that my discoveries are going against my teachings, which came from the Bible. How can it be false that God created mankind, but my discovery is saying that, man is not a special creation? So these kind of an anxieties of going against tradition or being true to your teacher exist in all civilizations. In India also they existed. And in India also some people said कि नहीं तुम दूसरे शास्त्र को पढ़ने ही नहीं जा सकते हो. दूसरे के आश्रम में अगर गए पढ़ने के लिए भी, then they had to come back and do a penance. And one person went to the other shastra to learn, came back and felt so sorry and so guilty that he put a lot of hay on himself and started burning himself. So all these stories exist. But on the other hand, we shall also not forget that all Indian philosophical systems begin with a long exposition of the Purva Paksha. That if I am a Nyayik, then I have to give an argument to my opponent, in this case, the Buddhists and the Vedantins. And I'll have to give all the real and imagined and the possible arguments. Sometimes when you look at Jayant Bhatt's Nyay Manjari and the others, you will find it's amazing that the exposition that he does of the other person seems to be so cogent that hardly he seems that, no, where is his philosophy coming? So this is the tradition. So we came to Purva Mimamsa, Uttar Mimamsa, the Sankhya and the Yoga, and then you have Nyaya and the Vaisheshika. The Nyaya tradition is a tradition which primarily, or which focuses greatly on the idea of epistemology, knowledge, logic, reasoning. It gives a theory, a detailed theory of truth, a detailed theory of language, a detailed theory of linguistic analysis, and continues to do that. They continued the tradition up to the 17th and the 18th century. Because there's, again, something which you as students of literature know, that they say death of Sanskrit led to the death of Indian philosophy, and Indian philosophy died, etc., in the 6th century and the 7th century. Not true. The Nyaya tradition continued till the 17th century. Jagadish and the others, great writers continued. The aesthetic tradition, in fact, became very dominant only in the 10th century. So this kind of an oversimplification, even on facts, is wrong. So these 6 big systems of Indian philosophy, which take as their sources some of the sutras, the Nyaya Sutra, the Sankhya Sutra, the Brahma Sutra, the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, all these were the sources. But they were not the only sources. They drew from many cases and developed, again, interestingly, many of these things developed in very different parts of the country. A large part of the Nyaya systems developed in one area of what is now the border of Bihar and Bengal, the whole Mathil area. And they developed, and they had big schools of that. So the language was Bangla, and some said Bihari and all the others. Again, the myth we think ki Bihar ke log kuch nahi aata, but that's the whole area of where it all emerged. Similarly, both the traditions of Vedanta, Ramanuj and Shankar, both came from the south of India. And it's interesting, when I went to Kaladi, I discovered that actually Shankaracharya in Kaladi is treated more like an incarnation of Shiva and hardly a philosopher. He's considered the more popular story and the temples are only of his childhood, that he was an incarnation of Shiva. He wanted to become a sage. His mother said, "Ki nahi, tum sadhu mat bano." So he went to a river where he was caught by an alligator. Then he said, "Ki allow me." Then the mother allowed and he came back. So those kind of mythological stories and religious significance of Shankaracharya is more prominent in the area where he was born, while in the rest of the country he is considered for his philosophical contribution. And again, for the establishment of what are called the Hindu sites on the four corners of the country, which is called the Shankar Digvijay, which was again a certain kind of a political kind of an agenda of unifying India through the four Shankaracharya peeths. And it's interesting that the peeth in the north has a Pujari from the south, from Kerala, and the vice versa. The east one has west one. So it is actually a very political kind of an agenda. So to imagine that these were world-denying people, he had no understanding, etc., that's not true. They were doing certain, but of course, as I said, all of that had an assumption that all of this has a value in terms of spirituality. So like one of the biggest things which everybody said, that, you know, there is so much of caste system. There is. And there is a recognition of the caste system for social necessities in many of these cases, completely unjustified by our lives. But alongside, there is also an understanding of believing that the soul, the supreme self with which we are identified, has no body and therefore no caste, no gender, no nothing. And the interesting story, which I think all of you know, but I will repeat, is the story which comes in the case of Manisha Panchakam. That this is again a story which you find, because you are all students of literature, so you know the narrative imagination. So one of the very important and a popular stories is about Shankaracharya coming on one of the bathing ghats of Banaras, and while he comes back after his ablutions and the others, he's going for prayer. Then there's suddenly a Chandal who walks up, and the Chandal is supposed to be the one who burns the pyres, etc. So he's an impure one, and maybe he had just burnt a pyre. So Shankaracharya hedges and haws and tries to go in one corner. And that Chandal then says, "Oh, noble one, who are you escaping from? Is it the skin, which is leather, which is not real according to your own admission? Is it the spirit, which is the same in me and yourself?" And Shankaracharya is properly chastened, completely demolished, and sits down at his feet and he said, "You cannot be an ordinary Chandal." And the story goes that no, he was then emerged as Shiva himself. And he said, "You know, what you are saying and what you are practicing is not right." And at that time, Shankara writes that very famous thing, which all of you remember, Chidananda Rupaha Shivoham Shivoham. So I'm neither the body nor the spirit. I'm neither the I nor the spirit. I'm neither man nor woman. I am the Chidananda Rupa, the ultimate self-same consciousness. So that's the kind of thing which also exists. Now, as I'm saying all these things, please don't imagine that I'm trying to say that everything is right with the Indian intellectual tradition. It isn't. But what I only want to call your attention to is that this is an extremely rich tradition which has survived not by being ossified, but by being debated and discussed. The moment you will take it as something which has to be kept in the almari and worshipped, you ruin it. As Simon Blackburn said, that it is only when argumentativeness finishes in philosophy that it becomes religion. The living tradition of philosophy continuously happens in terms of argumentation and re-argumentation. Of course, as students of literature, sometimes you may find that philosophical argumentation may become too dry, too technical, but which is exactly like what happens in your literary theory also. That I remember once doing a full month course in the tree technique of parsing of poetry. And I said, "Oh, we are ruining the whole poetry by putting the inflections on one part and this part or the other." But that has its great value, understanding the technical grammar. So some part of philosophizing is, of course, technical, and you will also, after some time, start relishing it. Let me also give you just certain names. Like one of the texts is called the Khandan Khand Khadya, where Khandan itself is supposed to be something which you relish. So these are the kinds, and when you look at the logical argumentation to prove the existence of God by Udayanacharya, it is called Nyaya Kusumanjali, that here is an offering of arguments in the form of flowers, which I am giving to you. The Nyaya God, of course, is not like the God who creates the world, because the Nyayics believe that the world is made up of atoms. The atoms are eternal. God only puts two atoms together to make Dvainuk. Then three such atoms get together to make him Trisrenuk, and that's how the world created. Again, a fascinating early account of how things happen. If somebody says it's true, is it true? It's not true. But this was the beginning of a scientific investigation, and they were trying to give an argumentation that how it all began. So, and that is how all scientific theory and all human stories begin. So the brilliance of these arguments, and again, the interesting thing is that according to Sri Aurobindo, as you all know, he believes that there are phases where civilization comes to a top, then there's a plateauing, then there is a descent. This must have happened with India as well. And he believes that when the British came to India, that was the time when we were going through a lot of internal self-reflection. And we were at the lowest decline. And you know, he's right. At the time of the British encounter, this is the time of engagement. You know that the colonials come in the time of the Mughals. In the time of the Mughals, who were the Indian writers, literarians who were writing? Kabir, Raidas. All of these people were writing in popular language, and they were criticizing some of the things which they found unacceptable in a civilization which had become too rule bound. कांकर पाथर मार जोड़ के मस्जिद लई बनाए हाँ तापट गुल्ला बांधे बहरा हुआ खुदा. All of those things. So there is an internal critique which is neither not a Muslim critique, not a Christian critique, not a JNU critique. It is an internal critique by an Indian person, which is a kind of a critique which happened with Buddha. Buddha did not study in any of these modern universities, but he's raising questions. So questioning has been the constant spirit. And the time of the British, there is this great questioning. There are three kinds of reactions. One, we say that whatever the British say is right, quickly become the brown sahib. The other is to say, no, everything that was written in the Vedas, back to Vedas. That also happened. But the third, more critical, engaged thing also fortunately happened in India. And that is what we find in the whole debates of Rabindranath's grandfather, Vijendranath, and Ram Mohan Roy, Michael Madhusudan Dutt, and all of that. That is the kind of thing which happens. And that is where Indian modernity comes. So I find all of that very interesting. And we can go to each of the systems and see. We can also see that what in literature we want to draw from this, from these inspiration of these philosophies of yore, and how some of these things, like say for instance, Prasad ki Kamaini is actually a beautiful interpretation of the Kashmir Shaiv Darshan. So also when you are reading many of the Kabir's poetry, you find it a great resonance of the Upanishads. When you read Rabindranath again, there is a great resonance of that. So Indian poets have great resonance of that. Maybe the Westerns also have that. How do they have it? Can you, if they do not have necessarily a resonance in the terms of a historical date, but you can connect it. And if you feel that there's a connection, because the difficulty, I shouldn't say the difficulty, but the position right now is that people like us and our parents are products of a colonial education. Our parents were born and brought up on Baba Black Sheep. We were also born on Baba Black Sheep. And I'm not at all regretting that. The point is that if the only thing is that if we start believing that only Baba Black Sheep is the good thing and everything which did not resemble it was trash, is something which needs to be cured, because there's much that we have. Secondly, I think we owe it to the global knowledge that what is closer to us here, which the West will have great effort to understand, we are civilizationally so close to it, it's easier for us to understand those concepts because directly or indirectly, they are part of our living. So it is part of our lives. So the great things which are written in the sutras, etc., have a very easy kind of an interpretation and rendering, even in Goswami Tulsidas and in the folk tradition. Have you seen any poetry in the West? Or I don't know, maybe there is, but I think, you know, the way playfully God is represented in the saint poets is amazing. You see Padmakar saying that, Sita si sati tyagi, झूठे कलंक से सीता सी सती त्यागी, साचे कलंकी को कैसे अपनाओगे? So this kind of entreaty of God, and representing and playing of a god in your own hands, like Surdas with his a blind poet talking about. These are, I think, have very rare literary and philosophical resonance anywhere else. I should not be saying that about all that. I haven't read all literature, but I think these are remarkable, and they are infused with great deal of philosophical thinking, which may not be consciously part of their argumentative, discursive intellect, but which is a part of their lives, as it were. So some part of that, I think, is a part of the Indian intellectual tradition. The Indian intellectual tradition, like all traditions, did accept sensory knowledge as very important, did accept reason as very important. It also acknowledged intuition, but intuition is not something, a strange kind of a capacity to receive. Intuition is to be understood as direct knowledge of certain truths, which cannot be made available to us by other means. The mystics are a classical example. And you know that mystics exist in all cultures. But the one difference which we find between India and the rest is that in India, yoga prepares you for mystic knowledge. And that, I think, is very important. That you, by a whole set of discipline, they tell you that how you can prepare yourself for a mystic experience. While in all other cases, mystic experience is just something which happens. But there are cases when it would happen, you would not recognize it. But if you have done the yoga practices, then your chitta would be so clean and chitta vritti will be so niruddha that you would be able to receive that. So that's the kind of one brief scattered introduction that I take you down on the question of Indian intellectual tradition and philosophy.
Thank you so much, Professor Chandra. And are there students who would like to ask some questions? Ansh, Diksha, you all may have questions.
Diksha, would you like to ask, or may I?
I think it overwhelms you, when you listen to so much of this, it can overwhelm you. And for my students who are online and listening in, if you have questions, I think you can always put them to me on the WhatsApp group and I'll get Dr. Chandra to respond to them. But Akanksha Pandey, since there are so many philosophies on God, which one should we believe in?
Yes, that I think is the most important thing which you need also. Belief in God, as we know, can be argued for, and some people would say that there's no need for argument for that. In philosophies, both Western and Eastern, some people say that argument to sustain your belief in God is important. And that's the kind of a position which comes from, particularly from Clifford and also in the Western philosophy of the Nyaya, that anything that you believe in must be rationally substantiated. On the other hand, there is also a tradition, which I think you people are more familiar with, is the continental tradition of Kierkegaard and Heidegger, where they say subjectivity is truth. So it is your relation to God which is more important than your arguments to prove his existence. Therefore, your relation to God and what you are supposed to do by his will is more important. Therefore, on the question of God, I think there's one position which says that, you need to believe in everything, and which includes God on the basis of reason. In Western philosophy, they say that there's a difference between two kinds of theology, natural theology and revealed theology. They say that God's existence can be proven by arguments as they are given by Thomas Aquinas and Summa Theologica, but that God is Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, this you can't prove. This has to come only through revealed theology, which is comes through revelation in the Bible. Similarly, in the Indian tradition, as I said, there's a large part of Indian tradition which does not believe in God at all. And it is okay not to believe in God. The highest form of Indian philosophy, the Shankara Advait Vedanta, actually considers Ishwar only to be Apar Brahma, which is a lesser thing. The Parabrahma is actually qualityless, complete joy and same consciousness. There is no devotee and the devoted. And therefore, in one way, it is a brilliant case of religious atheism, if you can have a term like that. So that I think is because as you mentioned, the Yajurveda is to propitiate gods. Now these gods are with a lowercase g. They are not God as the big one. They are like the Roman and the Greek gods who are angry and all of that. And you have the stories in the Puranas exactly. They talk about Indra. They talk about Indra getting too full of himself, then he being chastened by some clever trick of Vishnu and the others. So all those things form a part of the Puranas, which I
So you need to unmute yourself. It's fine, sir.
Right. So what I was saying was that in all these cases, the case of the Puranas contain many stories like the Greek and the Homeric stories, where they talk about gods and their anger and their anguish and their jealousy and etc. etc. So gods of the Vedas in the Yajurveda etc. are the ones who have to be propitiated with the yagya karma etc. And they are not the god of the Semitic religions, and also not the god that I think generally most people like to believe.
And for that, I would just like to put in here, even if you look at Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, they are seen as one, but they are not one, and then their duties are divided. And if you go back and look at the story of the creation of Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh, there is no image or a larger god there. They only talk of this, fire, or there was this, again, just something else there, not this one image. So to probably to explain this, that to look at it the way you would like to connect with it, and that it's not any one image. So there are multiple gods, and each of the gods can resonate with anyone. So I think if you are born into this country, you can resonate. You can choose a god that you resonate with.
Yeah, this is actually amazing. This is amazing, and that I think we need to see that how all these traditions were somehow or the other trying to make accessible something which they all like. The Brahma is supposed to be the creator of everything, but when you look at the image, as Professor Pandey was saying, the image is that Vishnu is lying in Kshir Sagar on the Sheshnag, and from his Nabhi there is a Kamal, and on that Kamal is Brahma is Virajman. Brahma is supposed to be Hiranyagarbha, which means that he came from an egg with a golden egg. Now the question is, who created that golden egg? Now that, of course, these are questions which will go on eternally, but they go on eternally even in science. Even if you believe in the Big Bang theory, then they say, oh, but who created the Big Bang? So these are imaginative representations, and what is fascinating is that how beautifully they are imaginative, and subsequently how much of art and craft and beauty, not only in painting and the others, but in poetry is represented by that. And now when everybody says that, we are now talking in literary criticism about the narrative imagination, this is narrative imagination at its best.
Yes, true.
Of course, the choices are yours. You have to choose a narrative, and you can't just be arbitrary.
Any other question coming up? Okay, so Shivansh says, are you going to read it? Shivansh says, sir, considering
the mystic element in the practice. Okay, you want to talk about the mystic elements. Yeah. The mysticism is a very large area, and I think the only thing which I would suggest would be that if you read William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, then you'll find that how beautifully he gives the two or three things about two or three things. One, they say that mystic experience is short, like it is ethereal. It stays for only a second and goes away. The second thing is that though it is much like feeling, yet it has a cognitive element. Three, it says that mystic experience is an experience which you have in passivity. You're not active. I actively am looking at this one and then trying to, or I actively pick up a glass. But in case of mystic experience, I am passive. So like you have the words with her, it turns upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. So that is the kind of thing that you in passivity suddenly receive a visitation, as it were. And the interesting thing which James says is that the mystic experience for the person who has it, it has complete authority. But from that, anybody else cannot be forced to accept what that person has said. Then he said that, across cultures, whether it is in Arabia, or it is in the Christian world, or it is in India, everywhere people talk about mystic experiences, and there is one commonality in all the mystic experience, and that is the sense of oneness. And it is not just a sense of oneness in the sense of an elemental oneness, कि सब कुछ पानी का बना हुआ है या सब कुछ atom का बना है. It is a sense of oneness and a great sense of ecstasy and a sense of a normative joy and value, moral value, that you feel elated. Because everybody who sees ki sab kuch ek sa, when Wordsworth sees those things, he's elated. That from the ordinary, and this elation is not just a physical kind of the yogi thing. It is a moral elevation that where you are able to see the oneness, the spiritual oneness of everything. So that is the kind of thing that they're talking. The one question which is coming repeatedly कि अगर नहीं मानते थे भगवान को तो किसको कर रहे थे, तो वो असल वही जवाब है. I'll go back to
Nishant wants to answer to that question कि यज्ञ किसके लिए किया जाता था अगर आप ईश्वर को नहीं मानते?
देवताओं को प्रोपिशिएट करने के लिए करते थे. तो आप संहिता को जैसे पढ़ते हैं ना, तो सबसे पहले कि वरुण है, वरुण is the principal one. And again,
okay, Rakesh, can I just put in a word here that we were pagan worshippers, so we were worshipping the forces of nature.
Absolutely,
so,
absolutely.
Pagan worship has been there, since man has been there, because forces that you can't control, forces that are not in your control, you fear it. So
and then you propitiate them through these things.
Appreciate those gods. तो वो सूर्य हैं, चाहे वो वरुण हैं, चाहे वो whether it's the goddess of the night or the moon or the harvests, we have all our rituals actually embedded deep in that fear. That these are things out of our control. We should keep the gods propitiating. There is no one god, but there are these other devatas, as you call them, heavenly gods, whom you keep propitiating. Please carry on, Rakesh.
Yeah, no, so and it's interesting that Varun is the god of Vedas. He's also the god of water, as it were. And interestingly, the first philosopher that you find in the Greek story is also Thales, who said that water is the final thing. Because why water? Because water is supposed to be the nourisher of all life. So that kind of a thing. And so it's interesting that the same thing as a natural force, same thing as the force of because one very interesting thing is the importance of vak, vani, word. So that comes so interestingly, that Vak Devi comes very importantly, and the whole tradition is only oral. So orality has been worshipped and distinctive worshipped as a human thing. This is so interesting. And there you look at Christianity. In the beginning there was the word. So it's so interesting. But the point is that when you are looking at it and you take up any particular text, it is so fascinating to see. And as students of literature, you will be able to see that there is also a very important kind of a conflict also in this in early Greek philosophy between the philosopher and the poet. The whole story in Republic of banishing the poets. But in India, the term for the poet and the philosopher are the same. The poet is the philosopher and the philosopher is the poet. Because so it's not that the poet is doing something imaginatively, creating from his own mind. The poet is the seer of truth. And now, thousands of years later, now when you're looking at a completely postmodern person like Richard Rorty and the others, they are saying that instead of looking at scientists and philosophers, we should be actually looking at the poet, because the poet actually has a vision of a possibility.
Yeah.
He's not defined by what is the case, like the scientist or the philosopher.
Yeah, but so, Rakesh, in the literary tradition, I mean, poets have been seen as seer. The poet is a seer.
Yeah.
Bhavishya-drishta.
Yeah. So that is very interesting. So they have this, and it's interesting that when you look at Abhinav Gupta particularly, he is a singer, he's a dramaturgist, he's a philosopher, he plays the veena, and he thinks that the complete thing is actually drama, where everything is enacted. And he thinks of the god as Maheshwar, who is ever unfolding, and Maya is a real Shakti. He does not believe in, like Shankaracharya, that there is a pre-existing Brahma who just has to be discovered, and Maya is an akshep. He believes that Maya is his true Shakti. It is an ever effulgent, joyous thing. He's dancing. So the dance of the Maheshwar. And that is why I think nothing can be more fascinating than the aesthetic theory which Professor Pandey is teaching you. Also because I constantly find, whether it's the gender equivalence, whether it is the caste knocking down, the Indian aesthetics is the place where everything gets knocked down very clearly. So Parvati is going to teach everybody the Lasya. There can be no dance and no art without a woman. The 4 pillars of the Natyashala have to be done by the 4 castes, because so you cannot have a stage without the 4 castes.
Rakesh, there's a question from this boy Utkarsh Sharma, who says, sir, please tell us something about the origin of Dhanur Vidya and Shastra Vidya, or Shastra. And do you think it has changed in time with different ages and different rulers?
I am sure it has changed over a period of time. When you look at the Kautilya Arthashastra, as I mentioned, the Kautilya Arthashastra mentions many, many things. And one of the things that it mentions is something which you all know, is that it mentions this 64 Kalain, 64 arts. Dhanurvidya is one of them. And if you will look at, it is so interesting, if you look at this example, what is the kind of tree and what is the kind of bark which you will have to take in order to make that is also well enunciated in the Natyashastra, which shall be the reed which shall be taken in order to tie up those things has been given unto that. Which shall be the kind of a bass which is most suitable in order to make a bansuri with 5 holes and 7 holes, has all been written in the Natyashastra. Now, Dhanurvidya, of course, is as a science of archery. I have not really gone into detail, but this I know that both the Kautilya Arthashastra and the Natyashastra give us a good account of
that. Rakesh, Nishant writes and wants a little bit of a clarification on the nature of Purush. He says that if the nature of Purush is Prakriti, then he wants to understand what is Purush and what is the difference. If you can just explain this a little more.
The Sankhya Karika talks about 2 ultimate elements.
I think you want to take your call?
Definitely. So the Sankhya Karika mentions that there are 2 ultimate elements. One is Prakriti and one is Purush. Purush is of the nature of consciousness, but inactive. Prakriti is a combination of the Sattva, Rajas and Tamas Guna. So the shlok, if I'm really, it's interesting. Nishi asked me to do Indian philosophy and I'm doing this. I actually have taught for years, mainly Western philosophy, and that's my feeling.
Maybe you can suggest some books that the kids could look into, or material they could read.
No, the shlok is Sanghat Pararthatvat, Trigunati Viparayat, Purusho Asti Bhoktivavat. So the Prakriti is a combination of Sanghat of the 3 gunas. It is meant for the bhog of the Purusha. So the Prakriti is active but unconscious. It consists of the 3 elements. It comes in touch with the Purusha, and that's how evolution begins. And then there are multiple jeevs created. Finally, they have to understand that actually I am not the Prakriti. The Purush starts imagining that he is the Prakriti, and therefore he gets deluded into that. Finally, when the Purush gets this knowledge that I am the self, then he gets mukti. There is a distinction between the Jivan Mukta and the Videha Mukta. The Jivan Mukta is a person who dies. But the Videha Mukta, the Videha Mukta. The Jivan Mukta is a person who in his lifetime gets to understand that I am not the Prakriti. But yet he continues for some time. For that, they give an example. It is like saying that when I'm actually running a chakki, then the chakki, after some time also when I have left it, it moves. Though the push has gone. Similarly, we have to actually bhogo the karma phal of the past lives. That we have to do even when we are completely knowing that I am not the Prakriti, yet I have to bear the fruit of the past karma. But once I know that, I shall not come again in that. So in that case, the Prakriti and Purush are two elements which can never get together, because Purush is actually Nitya Mukta. Now then, philosophically, there is always a problem. If Purush is Nitya Mukta, तो कौन किसको किसको भ्रम हुआ? प्रकृति तो चेतन ही नहीं है, तो कैसे भ्रम हो सकता है? Now these are very interesting questions which go on within the Sankhya tradition, and people answer it. But Prakriti and Purusha are two different elements. One is conscious, the other is not. But the combination of the two is necessary for evolution.
Now, Rakesh, I think what is gripping the mind of Nishant is perhaps that, he's looking at Purush and Prakriti in terms of gender. Istri or Purush ki tarah mat dekho. Don't look at it as Prakriti is representative of the woman or the feminine self, not that. Even, when you look at the Ardhanarishwar concept, the fusing of both is important because, and then there it's the feminine or the masculine, it has been explained that way, but that's not the ultimate explanation. It's for the common man to understand it. It goes far beyond that and above that, and then this whole thing that I think Shankaracharya mein ya abhi bhi meditation mein Sadhguru uses it. I am not the body. I am not also the mind. I am not the body. I am not also the mind. So this chant of I am not the body, I am not the mind, I think therein lies the truth of understanding what you mean by Prakriti and Purush coming together to create not being together and yet being together.
Yes. So this is the question which everybody has one small answer, that they say that when we are talking about the individual self, that the term is neither Purush nor Prakriti. The term is actually Jiva, which is a combination of the two. The other position also is that this remains, of course, an eternal question, that why did it all begin? If there it's a which is a question both as a physical and a moral question. Now, one answer which is given sometimes is the Leela concept, which again may not satisfy everyone. It does not even satisfy me, because if it is a Leela, then the suffering that we have, etc., 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 seems too much. And like in the times of pandemic, you are really so grieved by looking at certain terrible things happening to very little children, people who have been so nice and the other. So that doesn't seem to be right.
So Rakesh, there is one question. Sorry, Rakesh, are you saying something?
Yeah, so I'm only saying that this question, that why did it all begin? So one of the answers is that, which again is a very, very interesting answer, which is that God was feeling lonely. So he said, Eko ham bahusya. So I am feeling lonely, so I need to create more. So that is, and therefore he created the Leela. So loneliness and isolation is intolerable, not only for us in lockdown, but even for God. God would have felt terrible.
Okay, so there's one Utkarsh wanting to know if there are certain books that you would recommend for Indian aesthetics. So I think Indian aesthetics, but I would recommend some basic reading. But on basic Indian philosophy, something basic which the kids could read, you could recommend to us.
One book I think which you must all read and you'll enjoy. Of course, it looks a little intimidating because of its size, but Radha Krishnan's 2 volumes on Indian philosophy are absolutely a delight.
I would agree. That has to be read.
Yeah, because you would enjoy it, and you as students of literature would enjoy it very much, because he was teaching in Oxford. So he uses a lot of poetry of Yeats and Eliot and Wordsworth and Bible.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so he uses the language with which you are absolutely familiar. Many people in the Indian philosophy circles are very snobbish about Radhakrishnan. They run him down, but I still maintain he's one of the finest persons to write.
Yeah. And the second thing was, I think there is a question from Nishant again, which I'd like to quickly read to you. The Vedas have been divided into parts like Vedanta and Vedanga and Mimamsa, etc. What is the need for doing this?
Oh, both historical as well as content-wise. As I mentioned, the earlier portion, which is the Samhita, is actually only suggestive. The second is the Shastric stage, where you have the Dharma Shastras coming, where you have Manu, etc., and the Smritis and the other. The third is the stage which comes, the Sutrakal, which comes where you have the argumentative things coming. And that is the time of the Upanishads, where Upanishads are supposed to be containing elements from that in and given, not necessarily all the time the things which the said in the Upanishads are written in the Veda. They are not. So it is called the Prasthana Trayi. So the Veda, the Upanishad, and the third is the Gita. All the three have to be read together. Gita, many people, as it is said about the Gita, that it actually contains the quintessence of all the things which are written in the Vedas and the Upanishads. Now, this may not be accepted by everyone, including within philosophy circles, the Nyayiks, etc., etc. And then the most interesting thing is Gita is not interpreted in the same way by everyone. You look at Tilak's commentary on Gita, you look at Gandhi's commentary on Gita, you look at Vinoba Bhave's commentary on Gita, and they are entirely focusing on different kinds of things. You look at Gyaneshwari, which is again an interpretation. So there are different interpretations of the Bhagavad Gita itself. And just to provoke you a little further, what is the message of Gita also is fairly mixed, because at one portion he says that do what is your assigned dharma. Klayavyam masma gamaha partha, do your kshatriya duty. Then he says, jitva va bhokshase mahim, ritva va gatam swarga, that if you will win, you will get the prithvi, and if you will die, you will get. So that he's tempting him to get something. Then at one time he says, no, karmanne vadikaraste ma phaleshu gadatna, don't bother about the phal, do what is your duty and don't get further. Then when all of that is still not working, he gives the Virat Roop that, see, this is what I am. I'm the big brother. Everything's happening. You are happening in me. Don't even assume agency. It has already happened. And after having these given 5, 6, 7, 8 long arguments to a very, very intelligent man who's asking constantly, then why should I kill my uncles and aunts and etc., etc.? This is going to be so terrible, because actually it's interesting. It is in the whole parva is called the Shanti Parva, and it's a provocation to war. And when he said, after Krishna giving all sorts of brilliant arguments, subsequently he also said, having said all of this, yadicham tad kuru. What I am saying is that you do as you. And what does Arjun respond? Now I have understood, I shall do thy bidding. So it's very interesting to read the Gita, and it's really interesting that how many interesting arguments, and that is why it never ceases. That's the power of an epic. If the epic had a single kind of a meaning and a single kind of an interpretation, it would not be an epic. It opens itself to multiple interpretations.
Yeah,
that's the power. So,
okay, so Rakesh, my final question is from Vidushi. She says, our culture is both Brahminic and non-Brahminic, theist, atheist, agnostic. Many times it is rejected because of its oral form of preserving. There are lesser proofs of our culture being so rich. Didn't we lose its historical significance because of it being an oral tradition?
I don't know about that, because the orality also finished after a certain time, because as I mentioned, they started putting it into the palm leaf tradition. So of course, the earlier thing, we may have missed out on something. We certainly have. But the tradition of the palm leaf is also very, very hoary. So we know it for a very, very long time. And supposing we say that even if instead of 3,000 years, we have a 2,000-year-old culture, in that, I think, you would be amazed to see that what kind of a rich understanding. And interestingly, also, we must be, when Descartes was writing in France, almost 6 years later, you have Indians responding to him. So it's not that we were not responding. And look at the Indian people responding to the Greeks. Look at the whole iconography of the Buddhists. The Buddha image is the Gandhara art. So it's not that we did not learn from the Greeks. We did. Sometimes when so there has been an engagement, this kind of a thing that India was an isolated civilization and the Brahmins were doing it in their own corners, etc., is completely wrong. They were not. And of course, there are parts in which certain people, which is also true even now, and now some people would try to create their own silos and say that I am the chief. So people were doing that at different times. But as a civilization, this is not true. The Indian philosophical systems grew. And one thing which I should not I go without saying that, two absolutely brilliant systems which are not contained in these 6 are the one which I think one is being taught to you by Professor Pandey. the aesthetic tradition, the whole and the Natya Shastra, which is again sometimes considered to be the Panchamveda. The other very, very important kind of a contribution, which again has huge amount of bearing for you as students of literature, is the grammarians, Bhartrihari. So the language and its multiple functions. And when you look at Nyaya and when you look at Mimamsa, they were giving you tropes of interpretation. Now in the modern world, you're talking about hermeneutics of a text. Now, Mimamsa is actually hermeneutics. So the whole hermeneutic thing and the talk of the hermeneutic cycle, how to interpret a term, etc., all of that. So whether the word is the ultimate unit of meaning, or the sentence is the unit of meaning, or the context is the use of meaning, all these things have been debated and almost settled in the 5th century. It took 1955 for Grice and Strawson to come up with the idea of contextuality.
And Rakesh, even if you look at linguistic theory and linguistics, ki jitni theories aayi hain, structuralism, post-structuralism, you go back to the grammarians and you'll find them all rooted somewhere there. But
that
the point is that
that's what Sosua and the others are then going back to that.
Absolutely. But then we considered Sosua to be more important than what is there, because we've never ever sourced that, thanks to our historical, the whole historical thing of the British taking. It was lost much late. It was lost when the British brought in the kind of education system they brought in. Before that, it was there. It died away. And then we have to then again think about going back to it again.
Now is a good time. In fact, now is a very good time, because now what we have is that because of the new technologies, a large part of the manuscripts are also now available. Almost all
they're all getting digitized. I mean,
so
Microsoft. I mean,
so all libraries that you have of the world of Sanskrit texts, etc., are now
they're
available.
all getting digitized and not now available online. So much in Pali, Prakrit is also getting available online.
I would again request you. I'm going to send you a link. There is one Professor V.N. Jha, who is a great Nyaya scholar, and what he does is that he explains Nyaya in simple language, and he also does simple courses in Sanskrit. And I'm going to send a link that whoever wants to join, this time he's doing it free. Sometimes when you have to go over there, you can go there, because he has it in the most lovely places. He has them in Pondicherry and the Aurobindo Ashram and certain other places. But some of these online courses are absolutely free. And he has taken it upon himself to actually at least make children and everybody familiar with what it is. And again, what I'm only saying is that we must all familiarize ourselves with this. This is our global responsibility. We can make it available to the world. That it is the best, that it is correct, that it is wrong is not something which we have to make a prior judgment about.
And also not to argue it out. You don't have to stand and begin to fight that it is the best and it was there. The whole idea is Utkarsh is.
Yeah, people make a choice between, people choose between, some people like Shelley, some people like Auden, some people like others.
Rakesh, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so there is just this one final question. No more questions after this. We must let Professor Chandra go. What could Darwin be said to be? A theist or atheist based on his views on religion? And he considered religion as a tribal survival strategy.
No. Darwin was pursuing his scientific study in the true spirit of a knower, and he had no design to reject what was written in the Bible. In fact, he had a great personal conflict in his spirit when his findings seemed to be against religion. So he did not want to do that at all. The other big scientist, Newton, and the big empiricist philosopher, Locke, large part of their correspondence was only about the interpretation of the Bible. But the question again is that, since again you are students of literature, you would understand it better than other people do. Bible has a literal interpretation and a metaphorical interpretation. The literal interpretation of the Bible certainly gets countered by Darwin. But there is a whole understanding where, when they talk about the Garden of Eden and the earth and the fall of man, most people, enlightened Christians, say that it is actually to be understood metaphorically in terms of the distance of man from his true self and the Godhead. It is not really a story about somebody being thrown out of a garden. How can apples grow in a tree in the sky. So it's only a kind of an allegorical kind of a representation. So it has to be understood in that. And that does not necessarily get countered by science. A lot of scientists say that when we find great marvels of nature, when we find new discoveries, like supposing they find the pattern by which COVID vaccine shall function, it will not be countering God, but it would only be finding, oh God, what a wonderful thing that you have created, what kind of an intricate relationships. And the more you understand the intricacies of the natural plan, the more you marvel at the creator. That's one position which is being endorsed by at least 20 Nobel laureates who have written a small book which is called Faith and Religion. You can pick it up. Okay.
All right. So can we now say thank you to Professor Chandra? We've taken up almost over an hour and a half, or maybe an hour and 45 minutes. And so Nishant and students are saying a thank you to you for clearing doubts. And I'm very, very grateful to you, Rakesh, personally, that you could come here and you could be with them. And I'm sure that once we've gone through this whole session of my teaching, and if there's again feel like having you with them, we can arrange another one. On behalf of Avadh Girls Degree College and personally, my own students of my Indian Aesthetic Theory class, we thank you very much, and
Thank
our
you.
heartfelt gratitude so much. And all our students, it's been a pleasure listening to you. Thank you so much, sir. So all the students are there. Thank you so much for this wonderful session. And all the kids have written, we are looking forward to the next session, sir. So I'll get them updated and bring them back to you. Yeah. And you can send them more links. And we can get them
maybe we can choose something, speaking on Maya or speaking on Brahma, anything that you like.
Yes, I'll get the kids to give me a list of what they would like discussed.
Then I could be more prepared. This time it was just...
No, I just wanted you to give them a general idea, and then we can have another session. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful. Thank you all for attending this. Teachers from Avadh Girls Degree College, principal, and from the Department of English, Ansh Sharma and Diksha Sharma, both of who have arranged this and recorded this, and I hope you will post it so that one can all access this information and listen to Professor Chandra again on Facebook and also on our website. Thank you very much, Rakesh. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ma'am, may I end the session?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ansh. We can now end the session.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Upma, for being there.